If you walk into any museum in the world or ask a child to draw a pharaoh, they will almost certainly picture one face, the blue and gold death mask of Tutankhamun. He is the superstar of ancient Egypt. He is the face of the civilization. When we think of Egypt, we think of him. But here is the massive, historical irony that nobody talks about. In the grand scope of Egyptian history, Tutankhamun was a nobody. He was a footnote. He ruled for 10 short years, died as a teenager, won no great wars, built no giant pyramids, and left no lasting political legacy. In fact, shortly after he died, the rulers who came after him tried to erase his name from history entirely. He was supposed to be forgotten. The only reason we know his name, the only reason he is the most famous king who ever lived, is because he is the only one who managed to stay hidden. Every other great king, like Ramesses the Great or Thutmose III, was looted, stripped, and scattered by grave robbers in ancient times. Tutankhamun was the only one who slept undisturbed. His fame is an accident of survival, not an achievement of life. To understand the tragedy of this boy king, we cannot start with him. We have to start with the disaster he was born into. We have to talk about his father, the most controversial, hated, and radical pharaoh in Egyptian history, Akhenaten. For 1,500 years before Tutankhamun was born, Egypt had been a remarkably stable machine. The king ruled, the Nile flooded, and the people worshipped a massive pantheon of gods, chief among them Amun, the king of gods, whose priesthood in the city of Thebes was incredibly powerful. The priests of Amun owned vast lands, controlled immense wealth, and held political sway that rivaled the pharaoh himself. This balance of power, pharaoh, and priesthood kept Egypt running. Then came Amenhotep IV, Tutankhamun's father. He ascended the throne during the 18th dynasty, the absolute peak of Egypt's golden age. The empire was rich, powerful, and at peace. But Amenhotep IV had a different vision. He wasn't interested in the old gods. He was obsessed with a minor solar deity, the visible disk of the sun, known as the Aten. In the early years of his reign, he began to elevate the Aten above all other gods. This was strange, but not illegal. But then he went further. He declared that the Aten was not just the supreme god, but the only god worth worshipping. He changed his name from Amenhotep, which means Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. This was the Amarna Revolution. It was a shock to the system that shattered Egyptian society. Akhenaten ordered the temples of Amun to be closed. He sent stonecutters to hack the name of Amun off statues and obelisks across the country. He stripped the powerful priesthood of their wealth and influence. Imagine a modern president declaring that all churches, mosques, and synagogues are illegal, seizing their bank accounts, and declaring that everyone must now worship the sun itself. That is the scale of the upheaval. But Akhenaten didn't stop there. He decided that the old capital, Thebes, was too polluted by the old gods. So he ordered the construction of a brand new, virgin city in the middle of the desert, at a place now called Amarna Ancient Akhenaten. He moved the entire royal court, the government, the army, and thousands of artisans to this isolated, sun-baked plain. It was here, in this strange, hasty, utopian city, that a prince was born around 1341 BC. He was named Tutankhamun, the living image of Aten. The boy grew up in a bizarre world. The art of the Amarna period was radically different from traditional Egyptian art. Instead of the stiff, idealized, muscular figures we are used to, Amarna art showed the royal family with elongated skulls, pot bellies, and spindly limbs. It showed intimate scenes of Akhenaten and his famous wife, Nefertiti, kissing their children under the rays of the sun. It was naturalistic, strange, and alien. This was the world Tutankhamun knew, a world focused entirely on the sun disk, cut off from the rest of Egypt, ruled by a father who was less of a king and more of a fanatical prophet. But while Akhenaten was writing poems to the sun, the Egyptian empire was crumbling. Letters found in the ruins of Amarna, the famous Amarna letters, tell a story of neglect. Foreign vassals in Canaan and Syria wrote desperate letters to the pharaoh begging for help against invaders like the Hittites and bandit groups. "Save us, send archers, our cities are burning," they wrote. Akhenaten largely ignored them. He was too busy building temples to the Aten. Egypt lost territory, lost prestige, and lost its wealth. The economy, disrupted by the closing of the temples, began to tank. The people were confused and angry. They hid statues of the old gods in their basements, whispering prayers to Amun in the dark, waiting for the madness to end. Around the 17th year of his reign, Akhenaten died. What happened next is a messy blur of history, a game of musical chairs played on the throne of the world's greatest empire. There was a mysterious ruler named Smenkhkare who ruled for a brief moment. Some think this might have actually been Queen Nefertiti ruling as a female king, or perhaps an older brother of Tutankhamun. But whoever it was, they vanished quickly. And so, the burden of a broken empire, a hated religion, and a furious population fell onto the shoulders of a child. Tutankhamun was only 8 or 9 years old when he was crowned pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt. Imagine that. A third grader handed the nuclear codes and told to fix a collapsing superpower. Obviously, a 9-year-old cannot rule an empire. The real power lay in the hands of two towering figures who stood behind the throne, the puppet masters who would define Tutankhamun's reign. The first was an elderly, cunning bureaucrat who held the title God's father. He was likely related to the royal family, possibly Nefertiti's father, and he was a master of survival who had served Akhenaten but knew the wind was changing. The second was Horemheb, the commander-in-chief of the army. Horemheb was a pragmatist, a soldier who watched the empire shrink under Akhenaten and was itching to get back to the business of conquering. These two men looked at the boy king and saw an opportunity. They saw a chance to undo the heresy of Akhenaten and restore the old order without taking the blame themselves. Under their guidance, the boy king issued a decree that would define his life. He turned his back on his father's god. He abandoned the city of Amarna, leaving its palaces and temples to be swallowed by the desert sands. The royal court moved back to the traditional capitals of Memphis and Thebes. And most symbolically, the boy changed his name. He was no longer Tutankhamun. He became Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. His wife, his half-sister Ankhesenpotun, changed her name to Ankhesenamun. This was the Great Restoration. The temples of Amun were reopened. The dust was swept off the old statues. The priests were given back their lands and their power. The name of Akhenaten was smashed from the monuments, not by his enemies, but by his own son's government. The boy king was used as the face of the apology. He was the repenting king, the one bringing Ma'at cosmic order back to the universe after years of chaos. Physically, however, the living image of Amun was frail. The golden mask we see today shows a handsome, perfect youth. The reality, revealed by CT scans and DNA analysis of his mummy, was quite different. Tutankhamun was a product of generations of incest. Royal inbreeding was standard practice to keep the bloodline pure, but biology doesn't care about royal titles. Tutankhamun had a cleft palate. He had a curved spine, scoliosis. Most painfully, he had a club foot and a condition called Kolar disease, which caused the bones in his foot to die. He could not walk without a cane. In his tomb, Carter found over 130 walking sticks, many showing signs of heavy wear. This was not the warrior king smashing enemies in a chariot as shown on his painted chest. This was a disabled teenager who likely spent much of his life in pain, seated, watching the world through the windows of his palace while and Horemheb ran the show. Yet, despite his frailty, he was the king. He was the vessel of the divine. As he entered his teenage years, there are signs he began to want more control. He began to train in archery, perhaps seated in a chariot. He wanted to be the king his propaganda said he was. But fate, as it often does in tragedies, had a different timeline in mind. The clouds were gathering. The boy who had restored the gods was about to meet them. By the time Tutankhamun was roughly 18 or 19 years old, the restoration was in full swing. The empire was stabilizing. General Horemheb was leading campaigns into Syria and Nubia, reasserting Egyptian power and smashing the enemies who had grown bold during Akhenaten's reign. The official reliefs show Tutankhamun in battle, firing arrows and trampling foreigners, but it is highly unlikely the disabled king ever led a charge. He was the figurehead, the symbol of Egypt's return to normalcy. Around 1323 BC, Tutankhamun died. It was unexpected. He was not an old man. He hadn't even reached his 20s. For decades, historians and scientists have argued over how he died. Early X-rays in the 1960s showed a bone fragment in his skull, leading to breathless theories of murder, a blow to the back of the head. Was it the ambitious, the ruthless Horemheb? It made for a great murder mystery, but modern CT scanning in 2005 debunked this. The bone fragment likely broke off during the mummification process, or by the rough handling of the archaeologists. There was no blow to the head. What the scans did find was far more mundane and tragic. Just days before his death, Tutankhamun suffered a severe fracture to his left leg, just above the knee. It was a nasty break, the kind that pierces the skin. In a world before antibiotics, an open compound fracture was a death sentence. The wound likely became gangrenous. DNA analysis also revealed that the king was suffering from a severe bout of malaria. So, picture the reality: a frail young man, immune system weakened by inbreeding and malaria, suffering a catastrophic fall perhaps from a chariot, perhaps just tripping due to his clubfoot. The infection set in, the fever spiked, and the living image of Amun faded away. His death triggered a crisis. A pharaoh was supposed to have decades to prepare his tomb. He was supposed to have an heir. Tutankhamun had neither. He and Ankhesenamun had tried to. Tiny mummified fetuses were found in his tomb, the tragic remains of stillborn daughters who never took a breath. The bloodline of the great 18th dynasty ended with him. The burial was a rush job. This is the key to understanding his tomb. A pharaoh's mummification takes 70 days. That is the deadline. In those 70 days, the vizier had to find a tomb. The grand tomb intended for Tutankhamun, possibly KV-20 or the tomb later used by Horemheb, was nowhere near finished, so A made a decision. He seized a small, non-royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings KV-62, which was likely being cut for a private official. It was tiny, cramped, and totally unsuited for a king, but they had no choice. Workmen rushed to widen the corridors. Artists frantically painted the walls of the burial chamber, and only the burial chamber, unlike other royal tombs where every wall is decorated. If you look closely at the paint today, you can see microbacteria spots. The paint was still wet when they sealed the tomb, trapping the moisture inside. It was a panic. The treasures were shoved in. Furniture, chariots, beds, statues, jewelry, thousands of objects were crammed into the small rooms like a hoard in an attic. It was chaotic. They barely had room to maneuver the massive gold shrines that surrounded the sarcophagus. They had to cut off the toes of the mummy's coffin to make it fit inside the outer sarcophagus. It was a ceremony of haste. And then, the final act of the funeral. The old vizier did something unprecedented. In the mural painted on the tomb wall, is shown depicted as the Sem priest, performing the opening of the mouth ceremony on Tutankhamun's mummy. This is a role reserved for the heir and son of the king. By performing it, was legally and religiously declaring himself the next pharaoh. He buried the boy and stole his crown in the same stroke. The door was sealed. The corridor was filled with rubble. The entrance was hidden in the valley floor, and Tutankhamun was left in the dark. But the drama wasn't over. Back in the palace, the young widow, Queen Ankhesenamun, was terrified. She was the last royal of the dynasty. She knew A wanted to marry her to legitimize his claim to the throne. She was desperate. In one of the most shocking diplomatic moments of the ancient world, she wrote a letter to the king of the Hittites, Egypt's mortal enemy. The letter read, "My husband has died and I have no son. They say about you that you have many sons. You might give me one of your sons to become my husband. I would not wish to take one of my subjects as a husband. I am afraid." This was treason, an Egyptian queen asking to marry a Hittite prince. The Hittite king was stunned but eventually sent a prince named Zananza, but Zananza never made it. He was assassinated at the Egyptian border, who ordered the hit. Almost certainly Horemheb or A, they were not going to let a foreigner sit on the throne. Ankhesenemon's gamble failed. She was forced to marry A. She vanishes from history shortly after. A ruled for 4 years, then died. Horemheb, the general, then took the throne. And Horemheb decided to do some cleaning. Horemheb wanted to link his reign directly to the glorious Amenhotep III, bypassing the Amarna mess. He ordered the names of Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, Tutankhamun, and A to be hacked off the king lists. He dismantled their temples and used the stone to fill his own pylons. As far as official Egyptian history was concerned, Tutankhamun never existed. His name was forgotten, and this erasure saved him. About 200 years later, during the Ramesside period, workers were digging the massive tomb of Ramesses VI KV9 directly above Tutankhamun's little tomb. They dumped thousands of tons of limestone chips and rubble down the hillside. This rubble completely buried the entrance to KV6 too. Tutankhamun's tomb was now hidden under a deep layer of industrial waste. Centuries passed. The new kingdom collapsed. The Persians came, then the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Ottomans. The Valley of the Kings was looted again and again. Robbers tapped along every wall, looking for hollow spaces. They stripped the gold from the bodies of the mighty Ramses and Thutmose. But they walked right over the head of Tutankhamun, unaware that beneath their feet, under tons of rock, a king was sleeping on a bed of gold, exactly where the priests had left him 3,000 years ago. By the early 20th century, the Valley of the Kings was considered empty. Archaeologists believed every tomb had been found and looted. A wealthy American lawyer named Theodore Davis famously declared, "I fear the Valley of the Kings is now exhausted." He gave up his concession to dig there, but one man disagreed. Howard Carter. Carter was a stubborn, difficult, brilliant Englishman. He had no formal education, but he was a genius artist and excavator. He was convinced based on a few tiny clues like a faience cup with Tutankhamun's name found in the rubble that one tomb was still missing. He convinced the wealthy Lord Carnarvon, an aristocrat who loved fast cars and archaeology, to fund the search. For 5 long years, from 1917 to 1922, Carter dug. He moved thousands of tons of rubble. He found nothing. It was hot, dusty, expensive, and demoralizing work. By 1922, Lord Carnarvon had had enough. The economy was bad, and he was bleeding money. He told Carter he was pulling the funding. This was it, the end of the road. Carter pleaded. He begged for one last season. He said he would pay for it himself if he had to, though he didn't have the money. Carnarvon, swayed by Carter's passion, relented. One last season, he said. Carter returned to the valley in November 1922. He decided to dig in a place he had previously ignored. A triangular patch of ground right beneath the entrance to the tomb of Ramesses VI. It was covered in ancient workmen's huts. He ordered the huts cleared. On November 4, 1922, just 3 days after starting the digging, a water boy allegedly stumbled on a stone step cut into the bedrock. Carter's men began to dig. 1 step, 2 steps. A staircase plunging down into the earth. At the bottom, a blocked doorway. The plaster on the door bore the seal of the royal necropolis. The jackal and 9 captives. Carter's heart must have stopped. A sealed door. In the 20th century? He made a small hole and saw the cartouche on the inner seal. It was the name of the king, Tutankhamun.